When I think of those poor people on the beach, well, with no comforts whatever, a lot of children were about, they had babies and things like that, I can just imagine how awful they felt.
West Australia, a large empty area, was a pretty attractive proposition.
There must have been every encouragement for everybody involved in selling anything here to take the first ship home.
Why this man, Henry Edward Hall, should have left a good farming property in Shackiston, where he already owned what was a very profitable farm in those times. He owned a house in London. He's also said to have owned a chemist shop in the Strand. Why would he have left all this behind to come to a country like Western Australia? We have come to the conclusion that he was land hungry.
It had happened. An uncontrollable rush to the Swan River, and those ships that didn't bring settlers brought sheep and cattle. Stirling's promotion of the Swan River had been too successful. It was a colony formed for many reasons, the least of these, the welfare of the settlers. The government wanted an outpost for political reasons. Stirling wanted a colony for personal reasons, while the colonists and their families were in search of a richer, or at least a better, way of life. Not a penal settlement to help the overcrowded jails of England, but a free colony. A colony of free men who could quit the mediocrity of their present existence and travel to a new world. They sold up all they owned in England to follow James Stirling to the promised land, to the fabulous Swan River. The first free colony since the American War of Independence. On August the 23rd, in sailed the Marquis of Anglesey, carrying 177 more people. In September, the Thompson and the Amity, followed in October by 9 more ships: the Georgia, Lotus, Euphemia, Aurelia, Caroline, Cumberland, Governor Phillip, the Atwick, and the Admiral Gifford.
In these sand dunes they camped, fragile English women and their menfolk, with their possessions stacked around them, some of them using their furniture and luggage as protection from the wind and the rain. Their problems and difficulties are hard to imagine on such a day as this, but at every turn problems emerged. The anchorage was unsafe. There were no wharfs or jetties, which meant that everything, including people and animals, had to be brought ashore by a small boat from the ships at sea.
The weather was unpredictable. The sea breeze would come without warning. Precious possessions, while being unloaded, were lost in the sea or here in the sea. Cattle and sheep, if they survived the journey from the ship to the shore, could not be controlled. They just wandered off into the bush, never to be seen again. And the people, they camped here and waited. They had nowhere else to go.
Blackpool or Brixton, they're all mad. They don't know what they're doing. All out of their minds, crazy. We'll have to go back up.
reported this land to be good deserves hanging 9 times over. The fact is simply this. All the land that is good for anything, and that is but a small patch here and there, is kept as government reserves, and what land is given to Jews, stockbrokers, men of warsmen and the like. And out of 1,800 souls now come to this colony in hopes of living, or at least of not starving to the death, there are but a dozen who know what they are going to do or where they are going to go. The people look at each other in absolute despair. There are some who've been here 9 months and who have sown different seeds at different times, and invariably they have all died away. And there is not one person in the colony who has been able to raise either potato, cabbage, or any other vegetable. That man who's...
Poor Eliza Shaw. She had come from the comfort and society of the county of Leicestershire to the frontier harshness of Australia.
All things are swindled, you'd be better off.
Her husband, Will, had survived the Battle of Waterloo, but then, unexpectedly, he was retired in 1828. The decision was made. They would sail for the Swan River colony to start a new life. From the beautiful Leicestershire countryside, from the sweet village of Thrussington, from hunting with the Duke of Rutland's pack, from the meadows and fields under the shadow of the great castle of Belvoir, Eliza Shaw found herself in the sandhills of Fremantle.
There are elements of this enterprise which verge on the absurd, though I count myself lucky to be alive. Our ship, the Marquis of Anglesey, lies wrecked at the mouth of the Swan River. Many people have lost everything they possess, except for their lives. People are everywhere, in a sort of trance. 'Tis England they miss.
It seems a complete burlesque altogether. Not a farce, for they are generally laughable, but all here is really and truly cryable. You will think I'm giving you a woeful description, but you in England have no idea of what is going on here. Still, we live in hopes that something may yet turn out for the better. Here we are under our tents, set down close to the sea beach, higgledy-piggledy, up to our ankles in sand. Our eyes suffer dreadfully, as the winds here are so high at times they raise the sand and cover everything. Our sofa serves Shaw, myself and George, and sometimes Mary as a bedstead. The boys and Markram lie on beds on the ground, and more complete gypsies you never beheld. Still, we bear it much better than you would expect. You would smile to see the ladies, gents, children and working people, many without shoes or stockings, some carrying firewood, others cooking, washing and nursing their babies. Captain Sterling, with Mrs. S, another lady, and Mr. James Henty and some others, went off last week to explore the land to the southward. This ought to have been done before the people arrived. They're all at their wits' end.
Just sitting here among the dunes for weeks, for months, their precious possessions, their pianos, their carriages, their furniture and luggage, and themselves, all at the mercy of the elements awaiting the governor's pleasure. And what they found was a land beyond their comprehension. Trees stunted, misshapen, trees blackened by fire, draped in strange grey-green leaves. bushes covered with thorns and prickles. Mosquitoes and spiders hanging like floss. A bushland full of freakish creatures, the like of which they had never seen or dreamt of in Britain. There were strange snakes and incredible ants. And the terrifying sounds of the Australian bush at night.
This is the spot where Captain Stirling camped. And this is the spot where Captain Stirling thought to himself, I'm going to take this land. Some of the Aboriginal people most probably was watching him. And they thought to themselves, what is he going to do? They didn't know that he was planning to take our land. Well, I think they must have been afraid. They must have been frightened, really frightened. I think if it was me, I'd be really scared to see the ship coming in and see white people coming off of it. For the Aboriginals those days, that they'd run away night to creep back and see what they can see after. I don't think they'd cry about it, but I think they'd worry about it. Wanted to know, you know, what was going to happen to their land. Just the Aboriginals on their own. Then they see the whites come and started to knock the trees down and push the bush further back. They used to like the trees because of the shade. They used to put snares for possums and kangaroos. We used to do that when I was a child. And my dad used to say that they used to get under the water, they'd dive under the water, and then come up where they see the duck's foot and they'd pull the duck down and kill the duck. And that's the way they used to cut their duck.
Stirling's most pressing need was to issue land to these hundreds of settlers wandering aimlessly around at the mouth of the Swan River. Both he and his Surveyor General, John Septimus Roe, were under enormous pressure to peg out more land and issue it quickly. In August, 3 months after the arrival of the first ship, there had been 26 applications for land. By October, there were 80. But of the 80 applications received, only 22 had been granted. These 22 represented nearly 100,000 acres. In the panic, river-fronted grants were marked out by Stirling and Roe, sailing down the river and tying ribbons to trees to mark the boundaries. Clearly, Stirling was going to run out of river land. His answer was to limit the river frontage to 1/2 mile and make the grants narrow. The outcome of this exercise was further chaos. Some settlers found their titles covered land that extended under the sea.
Well, I think he took it very casually, really. He had his Matilda there, and that was all that worried him. She had to put up with the inconvenience, I suppose. He was sorry, I think, but he was used to inconvenience, having been in the Navy and on sea and that sort of thing. And they have a terrible time at sea, don't they? They tossed about in little, like a cork on the ocean. And when he was 10 years old, he went to Christ's Hospital in London. Christ's Hospital is the blue coat school, where the boys wear the blue coats right down to their ankle and yellow socks. He didn't want to go, but he went, and he didn't really want to take mathematics, but he did. And he was a very good scholar, and he was there until he was 15. And he used to write the wonderful letters to his father and mother about, they were very meagerly fed. They hardly had anything to eat. They used to have most peculiar things, such as beer for breakfast and cheese for tea. He came from the sea to a man in the land. And from then on, that was his life. It was to be his life. And he started that way. And he stayed that way.
But by 1830, the word had reached England that all was not well with the infant colony, and all was not true in regard to its richness.
Remember that piece over there?
Over 1 million acres of land had been granted to settlers, yet only 200 acres were under cultivation. But of this amount, more than a third was held by one man, a tragic figure, one of the first to be caught by the Swan River mania. He was Thomas Peel, cousin of the most prominent political figure in Britain, Robert Peel. Thomas Peel joined some other London speculators in proposals to the British government in 1828. They wanted to form an association of adventurers to colonize the Swan River as a private company. The government would not agree to their terms, and some of the speculators soon lost interest. But not Peel. He persisted and finally became partner with a convict named Solomon Levy. By 1819, Levy was pardoned and, as a merchant, prospered. In 1828, he was in London, forming a secret partnership with Thomas Peel. It was kept secret because of Levy's religion. The two men proceeded with a plan to build an empire on the Swan River. They formed a company to develop hundreds of thousands of acres of a government grant at a point where the Swan River met a lesser river, the Canning. Soon, Thomas Peel's proposal was being attacked, and in no time at all, the storm of a scandal was blowing around the streets of London. It was a witch hunt. His cousin, Robert Peel, the Home Secretary, was accused in the British House of Commons of obtaining 250,000 acres of the best land for Thomas. Political cartoons appeared showing Thomas Peel plucking the Swan River to feather his own nest.
Bloody Peel! Shine!
After some time, the commotion died down, and Thomas Peel and his partner continued their plans. They issued this handbill in London, offering farms from 200 to 1,000 acres and transport to the colony on reasonable credit aboard Peel's ships. The charge for each common passenger was £25, and for each cabin passenger, £60. His handbill also offered to supply cattle, sheep, pigs, ducks, geese, fowls, and turkeys, and to pay common labourers, ploughmen, thatchers, and gardeners 3 shillings per day, and rough carpenters, bricklayers, masons, and wheelwrights 5 shillings a day. Peel purchased the sailing vessel Gilmore of 500 tons and chartered 3 others, the Hooley, the Industry, and the Rockingham. Under a revised government scheme, the Peel enterprise was required to be at the Swan River before November the 1st, 1829, with 400 settlers. If this date was kept, the British government had promised Peel and his partner 250,000 acres. This deal between Thomas Peel and the Colonial Office was arranged before Captain James Stirling left England and kept quiet until after his departure. In August 1829, Peel, aboard the Gilmore with 169 people and an ark of animals and birds, sailed from Plymouth. But by November the 1st, there was no sign of Peel and his people. Stirling could not wait. He allowed the 250,000 acres reserved for Peel to be thrown open to other applicants. Peel arrived on December the 15th, 6 weeks too late. He set up this campsite 7 miles south of Fremantle among the sandhills. And here his 169 hopeful settlers were forced to live in a state of despair, their Swan River grants given to other people. They camped inside rows of luggage and equipment with sickness and disease spreading in the intense summer heat of Western Australia. Peel himself was forced to camp in a wooden stall that had carried one of his horses from England. The tragic circumstances of Peel's settlers forced Stirling to honour the original promise of the British government. He gave Peel the 250,000 acres, but it was really useless land, mostly sand hills and stunted scrub. On top of this, the Hooley turned up with 173 settlers, and on May the 12th, the Rockingham with a further 220. But then the Rockingham ran aground. The weather was vile, and as she anchored, a sudden gust of wind snapped her cable. The 220 men, women, and children wallowed in misery as she thrashed about in the violent sea. They eventually got off safely, but the Rockingham was wrecked. Much of their equipment and possessions were thrown into the sea or left to rot on the beach. The queues of ships waiting at Fremantle with eager settlers became fewer and fewer until ships ceased to come. And the storm that wrecked the Rockingham drove 4 other ships ashore. Benjamin Disraeli once said, "Despair is the conclusion of fools." But then he wasn't on these beaches or in these sand dunes in the 1830s. The men who had brought their wives and families from Britain to this Bay of Despair at least had the grog shops in which to drown their sorrows and lament their misfortune. But for the women and children there was little consolation.
The whole element of survival was total adventure, in my opinion, for these pioneers who stayed in work. Were setting a very poor standard of life here, and apparently there were many people drunk every day. Well, I believe that without the consolation of alcohol, it's doubtful that you'd get European people able to endure the hardships.
For nearly 4 months I battled with that ground out there. I put in seeds 4 or 5 times and never sighted a single blade of wheat. In fact, we come out here at the wrong season, though what the next shall produce, God only knows. And now I've opened this public house to keep body and soul together. I can't afford to be too particular. It enhances the value of me grant, and if I can get 300 or 400 pounds for it, I'll sell and go to Tasmania.
Don't talk to me about this place. Oh, the governor. 4 times I've been up that river. 4 times to see about my land grants. I mean, he just won't see me. It's cost £20 in river trips. I mean, I've just got to get my family off that detestable beach. My boy's got dysentery, my wife's near exhaustion with worry, the water's bad, and we're losing the season for planting.
I'm afraid our governor has a most unfortunate memory. He constantly forgets his promises, the ones that he finds convenient to forget. He changes his mind so often. One cannot place the slightest reliance on his word unless one has it in his own handwriting and with his signature.
Peel's out of money. I've heard he can't pay his servants, and he's trying to give them notes he printed himself. But they won't have a bar of it. As soon as they find a loophole, they'll leave him and his violent temper. They detest him. And serves him right. He was part of that sterling swindle. The government promised us first choice of land. That's what they promise us. First to arrive gets the first choice. And what do they do behind our backs? Give him 400,000 acres before he leaves England. That stinks.
This is what the Times said about him, his crew. Those persons who have gone, or who contemplate going to that settlement, the Swan River, have been defrauded. They'll find on their arrival that all the land available for useful purposes has been already appropriated. The settlers who are already gone were assured by that gentleman who was appointed governor that no land would be given but to settlers who arrived at the settlement with property. That no land could be allotted in this country, meaning England, to any individual whatsoever. Well, in short, the only really serviceable part of the new settlement has been granted to one gentleman. This is what the Observer had to say. The most valuable part of the land has already been parcelled out to 3 persons who have no intention of emigrating. One of them, an illegitimate son of a royal duke. Another, the illegitimate son of a noble lord. And the third, a cousin of the Home Secretary, Robert Peel.
Hey, what do they call him, orange or lemon?
Rind.
Peel's enterprise was a total washout. His little town of Clarence, named after the Duke of Clarence, now William IV, was a scene of tragedy. It was summed up in a document described as a monster address, which a large number of the settlers signed and forwarded to Stirling. The address was eventually to find its way to Prime Minister Earl Grey in London. Of Thomas Peel's town of Clarence, the document stated, The ghastly spectacle of the town site of Clarence, its sole edifices crowded, hurried, and neglected tombs. Its only inhabitants, corpses, the victims of disease, starvation, and despair. The sea beach strewn with wrecks. The hills and borders of the river studded with deserted and half-finished buildings bear witness to these consequences and speak of brave men, delicate females, and helpless children perishing by hundreds on a desert coast from want of food, of shelter, and even of water. But while Peel's misfortune was by far the most spectacular in terms of his loss, others were in an equal state of despair.
Well, he came out here with a friend called Daniel Scott. It is said, with a bit of persuasion from Sterling, who eventually became the local governor. He arrived here on the 5th of August with some merchandise, including some liquor. That's why we still sell it here today.
Very much the same as they'd have lived in England, except with what you might say a slightly different environment. They were chasing kangaroos rather than foxes.
We assume that he had this business in its doing his first sales before the end of August 1829.
But we do have records of Lionel Lucan's appointment of an agent in England to send out goods for him to sell out here, and he and his brother had intended to become merchants as well as landowners, because merchants appeared to be getting a bit more money and ending up with the land here at that time.
We do know that in early September he wrote a letter to a Mr. Brown, who was the secretary of the administration here, seeking advice as to the issue of a liquor licence, so as to protect himself from any illegal actions that he may have been involved in.
And Lionel, who was, I gather, to the end of his days, a bit of an optimist and always looking for something new and exciting, came out here. And in the early 1830s, he took over a grant, Deepdale, in the Turgee Valley, or rather in the Avon Valley, just where the Turgee Brook comes in, which had been originally taken up by Governor Sterling.
Nothing but chaos. White, blinding sand, no yards for their stock. The water was bad. There were a few huts, but tents and marquees, and nothing organised to receive them. It was pretty shattering after all the optimism that had gone in, all the planning.
And one wonders why they ever did survive and stay here.
Acting on Captain James Sterling's advice and his glowing description of this new country, Henry Edward would be able to come out here and establish a fortune and an inheritance for these sons of his.
Their stuff was being affected by the weather and by thieving. Thieving was rife, and this was a great problem with all of them. At that particular time, it was a very hot summer. It was 115 degrees, and this shattered the women who just were distracted beyond words with tiny children. The water was bad. There was dysentery. In fact, things were very, very difficult.
But by 1830, the word had reached England that all was not well with the infant colony, and all was not true in regard to its richness. The anchorage was described as dangerous, and the climate and the fertility of the soil were scathingly attacked. is quite clear that the prospects held out to immigrants as respects the luxuriance of the soil and its fitness for agricultural purposes, upon which alone they must depend, were completely delusive. It will be as we suspected, that instead of the land about the coast being a sort of paradise, it is for the most part little better than a barren waste. If this be all that can be said of it, the settlers had much better have gone to Ireland and cultivated the bogs. As news filtered through the villages, towns and cities of England, the Swan River mania quickly died. In the first 2 years, the population had reached 4,000 souls, but within 2 more years, this would drop to 1,500. But by 1831, those who remained were finding a new world hidden behind the harsh mask that the western third of Australia wore. Those who remained were learning the secrets of the wilderness. They were finding rich lands beyond the low mountain ranges. They found strange plants that ate insects. Some that glowed in the dark, while others satisfied nature by sending the bushlands hysterical with colour. This new land was full of all the excitement that went with discovering new things. Strange plants and trees. Plants that survived in soil that in summer became too hot to touch with the naked foot. Fern trees that grew in timbers as stout as English oak. And grass trees that stood higher than a man with trunks made of charcoal. The infant colony by the Swan River survived. It survived the harsh criticism and judgment of its own people, and it survived in spite of the adverse publicity and scorn from the English press. Those who remained had to face immense hardship. Problems not foreseen and some never before experienced by Europeans plagued their early years. But those who stayed managed to live and to some degree prosper. But besides the new settlers, there were also the old ones, the original inhabitants, the Aboriginal people. As the British immigrants moved out into the lowlands of the coastal plain, they pushed out the tribe people. The time was approaching when conflict would lead to bloodshed.